Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Soleimani.
And I am Carolyn Zenss. It's a pleasure for us to be here today to talk about designing for behavior change, and more specifically, how to achieve long lasting user product relationships through better design decisions. So, before we dive right in, here are the main things that we'll talk about. First, who we are and how our relationship with Availity came to be. Then the rest of the sections will be about designing for behavior change. Things we think are key to keep in mind as we work on products and solutions intended to lead to behavior change. And I'm going to tell you right away, there's at least two ways in which you can potentially use those principles. So you can use them to assess whether an existing health application has what it takes to successfully change someone's behavior. Or you could also use them as guides as you create a new solution intended to change behavior. We're going to reserve some time for questions at the end, but if you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and write it in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of the screen. So Alex and I are both interaction designers for a company called Macadamian. And Alex, I believe you and I met back in 2016 when I joined another company and Alex was actually already working there. And I didn't like it that much, to be honest. So I moved on. And when I joined Macadamian in 2018, designing for healthcare really became a passion. And I basically couldn't stop bragging about it and telling Alex about all the wonderful projects that were really designed to help change patients' lives for the better. Eventually, he caved and he joined me a few months later. So flash forward to the spring of 2020, Macadamian was acquired by eMIDS. eMIDS is a leader in digital engineering and transformation solutions to the healthcare and life sciences industry. So we have a global presence of over 2,000 employees across the US, Canada, where Alex and I are located, India, Europe, as well as Latin America. And as Macadamians, I just want to say that we're really proud to be part of such a large family. And what is it exactly that we do? So we are what we call a full service software design and development consultancy. So what that means, we deliver business strategy, user insights, and technological solutions to our clients. We approach every project design first. And with such a large team of creative brains, so interaction designers, visual designers, data scientists, we like to believe that we're always fun to work with.
This past year, we really enjoyed the privilege of working with the Availity team to kick off the redesign of their provider portal. In our endeavor to reimagine the provider experience, one of the ideas we dreamt up together and eventually accomplished was to change the way providers were searching for patients. While this change was in line with some of the more modern search experiences out there, the user research we did showed that many users struggled with that change, even if it was making their life easier or faster or more efficient or simpler. The list goes on and on. But users had become accustomed to their way of doing things, stuck in their ways, if you will, and therein lies the problem. Let's start with the psychology of habit formation. Habits are everywhere around us. While some studies show that about half of our behaviors could be considered habitual, others claim it could be as high as 90%. Habitual human behavior is not an easy thing to change. The science of it comes down to the fact that a series of synapses have formed physical connections to each other, offering the path of least resistance for a thought to travel. The basic idea is that your brain prunes away connections between neurons that don't get used and builds up connections that get used more frequently. Rewiring this to modify behavior involves learning, repetition, consistency, and ultimately independence, amongst other things. We see this barrier in our space time and time again. A newly diagnosed diabetic patient who's trying to manage their blood glucose levels, or someone who's trying to eat healthier and exercise more, or even a provider who's learning a new software platform while trying to offer the best possible care experience. These are all uphill journeys that require both the removal and addition of behaviors and require quite a bit more than sheer determination to be successful.
So there are so many digital applications out there, but most just can't seem to retain users. And despite that, the industry continues to grow. So if we just talk numbers for a second, the global mobile medical application market is projected to reach $20 billion by 2027, thanks in part to the COVID-19 pandemic that forced the players to digitalize the healthcare landscape. And just to give you an idea, in 2020, it was worth around $4 billion. But sadly, like when you look at data, let's say on medication adherence, and that's just one example of an issue that health apps are trying to address. Today, between 40 and 50% of people living with a chronic disease don't take their medication as prescribed. And that percentage hasn't improved since the 80s. So that's almost 40 years. So those numbers really caught our attention. And we decided to take a closer look at the issue. Why do digital apps fail? And we came to the conclusion that there's 3 layers to consider when you design for behavior change. The person, so that would be Alex, myself, you listening, the application itself, but also the environment. And successful application has to account for the intricate relationship between the 3. So let's consider an easy example using diabetes that Alex mentioned earlier. Let's say you have a group of ladies who are using an application to manage their diabetes. They mostly use it to track their glucose level, but let's say also to find inspiration for physical activities. And together, they start a group to motivate each other. One of their main activity is to do aqua fitness a few times a week. But then COVID starts and the pool closes. And just like that, their main activity goes out the window. Chances are the application doesn't adjust and it's going to keep telling them to go to the class, or is going to ask them to log how the class went. So the app, by not taking into account the environment, basically failed to help those ladies. So this example takes us to the importance of mapping the journey that a person and an app should share. And accounting for that shared journey, we believe can make a huge difference when you're designing for behavior change. So to be able to capture the story of a user's journey, that's really critical to basically understand what is it like for them to have the experience with the application. And that's what we refer to as journey mapping. So when you look at the interaction between the person and the app as a journey in itself, we actually believe it can be simply broken down into 4 distinct stages. And we like to think of it as a relationship between 2 people. So first comes the first date. That's what we call the pre-onboarding stage, or anything that happens before someone downloads the application. Then the onboarding stage, that can be compared to a honeymoon phase, when the interaction just starts and everything should be very new and very exciting. And then the third stage, or daily usage, is where the heavy lifting takes place. So that's when the user is the most active with the app. And this would hopefully be comparable to a long-lasting partnership. And then the last stage, we call that growth and beyond, or basically till death do us part. So I'm not referring to the death of the person, but the death of the app, in the sense that it would be neglected and eventually deleted from someone's smartphone. And far too often, professionals spend their time, so designers and developers, they want to design functionalities of the apps. They think about the value it may bring to the user, which is good. But regardless of how great or how useful a feature may be, If a person doesn't download an application or doesn't make it past the signing up process, they will never get to experience all those cool features. So that's why we believe it's really important to pay close attention to all of the 4 stages as you're creating a solution.
Next, let's look at the concrete design principles that we strive to apply to our projects when we redesign health apps. Now that we understand the importance of the person's journey with an app, how can we concretely design better apps for better health outcomes? We start by looking at the existing frameworks that were documented and available to us. Specifically, we explored 2 different worlds. The first is gamification, which came naturally to us as it was more common in our industry. Gameful design techniques have been around for a few years now. They're being used by gaming companies, but also by e-commerce players and social networks to retain users and get them addicted to their digital experiences. But we quickly realized that there was almost no health outcome data to rely on. So we turned to behavior change techniques, which haven't been extensively used in digital settings, but definitely have succeeded in the clinical environment. Most importantly, there's a ton of outcome data associated with traditional behavior change techniques. By combining these 2 together, we figured that if we take what works digitally and what works in person, find commonalities to create our own set of design guidelines, then we'll eventually find out if they work or not. So next, we're going to share some of these principles that we came up with.
So remember the 4 stages of the journey. We're going to break it down even further now by introducing 6 of our design principles. And to tell you a little secret, we actually have more of them. We have 13 in total, but for today, we prioritized 6 because, well, we don't have all day to talk about behavior change. So for each principle, you can see on the screen, we identify the stage the principle is best initiated or used in. So here we're talking about trust, credibility, and transparency, motivation, education, aesthetic experience, transcendence and empowerment. And lastly, as we mentioned earlier, the environment plays a huge role in a person's ability to change their behavior. So we also want to cover the person-app environment loop. And so what we're going to do next, Alex and I are going to take turns to walk you through a definition of each of those 6 principles, combined with some examples that we hope you will find useful. So let's start with trust, credibility, and transparency. So that principle is a mouthful, but I'm going to say it's the simplest one to understand and master when it comes to making design decisions. So simply put, the app should inspire trust and be transparent. So what that means is that the user should not have to wonder why a particular personal information is collected or required. And the app should be ethical too. The user's information should be used for a specific purpose that should be clear to the user. So I have to mention targeted ads. I'm sure all of you have seen those before, that pop when you use free applications. Those may lead to additional revenue for the app, and they may collect data that is not always transparent to you. Aren't those annoying? And finally, the app should be credible. So that means done in collaboration with experts in the field, or today in the US, applications can also be FDA approved. Before I show you the examples, I'll finish with a question for the audience. Have you ever used an application and wondered, who designed this? If you haven't, next time you download a new app, look it up on the web and see if you can validate the developer's credentials. And here's the first of 2 examples that I'm excited to share with you. Headspace. So I think it's quite popular. Some of you may have used it before. It's an application that teaches you how to meditate. So early in the onboarding, the app emphasizes its scientific roots to persuade people that Headspace is the right choice. They have a team of scientists, they work with well-known universities, and so on and so forth. So from a design execution standpoint, what this tells us is that we need to make sure to share proof of our hard work, whether that's research or anything that will help establish credibility. Even if you've been working on your product like for the past 5 years, let's say, don't just assume that people will know what your product is. And if a user asks, why should I trust you? Make sure they can find an answer to your web presence as well as your application. So here's another interesting example. LifeWorks. LifeWorks is an application for companies to invest in their employees' wellness. And this is really an interesting take on how data is collected, with subtitles such as feel supported, feel rewarded, feel connected. And those are surfaced into content snippets right on the page where the user agrees to the privacy policy, rather than being buried in a separate page that usually none of us bother to read. So the app acknowledges what data is collected, it explains how that data is used, and most importantly, it does so in plain language. And this is great design that helps establish trust upfront.
Next up, we have motivation. And while it may seem obvious that motivation is a requirement for any kind of behavior change, it's especially important to understand the sources of motivation at play and the periods of time at which they're most effective. First and foremost, the app should help surface the person's motivation. Sometimes it takes a bit of digging to understand the why that lives 3 layers below the initial reason, but it really helps to get to the core of that person's motivation system. While doing so, the app should also tease apart the different forms of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Now, it's widely believed that intrinsic motivation is the right kind of motivation if you really want to change, but this downplays the role of extrinsic motivation, which can be equally as effective. An example, a doctor telling a recently diagnosed patient that they need to change is a form of extrinsic motivation. That patient may not have the time to fully understand their diagnosis, acknowledge it, process it, and develop those intrinsic motivations. They need to rely on the intrinsic motivation from the doctor in this case, at least to begin their journey. Badges, achievements, high scores, leaderboards, these are all other examples of extrinsic motivators that we're all accustomed to seeing in the world of gamification. The app should then take these data points and leverage them throughout the entire journey. This can take shape in many forms. One example could be reflecting these motivations to a person when they've experienced a setback, or incorporating these motivations whenever the person is facing a period of great difficulty or challenge. A really good example is Noom, which is an app that uses a psychology-based approach to change eating habits. You may be familiar with it. Noom prompts people to uncover their ultimate why. First, it begins with super goals, the goals that you want to accomplish by the end of the course. These could be losing 15 pounds or running your first 5K marathon. But then it dives deeper to discover your ultimate why, the reasoning behind those super goals. For instance, maybe you want to lose 15 pounds so that you can feel good in your own skin. Feeling good in your own skin would therefore be your ultimate why. Your ultimate why should excite you and should inspire you.
Next, let's look at education as a design principle. When people understand how the tasks and information in the application relate to their outcome, it actually increases their chances of succeeding in changing their behavior for the better. So for example, Macadamian worked on an application that helps patients manage their diabetes. And one of the features was to monitor sleep. So someone who's new to diabetes may not understand the link between the two and needs to be educated on that part. And sometimes it's just not clear how an ask in an application can benefit the user. And we notice this on a regular basis when we evaluate health apps. So the advice here is that applications should keep the user informed, highlighting how what they're doing actually benefits them. And education is important, not only for behavior change, but also to shift people's attitudes towards the change and process. And here's one of my favorite examples. It's an application for personal use, and education is just beautifully executed. MyFitnessPal, it's been around for a few years. You may be familiar with it. It's an application and a website that helps you track diet and exercise. What it does, it provides educational snippets about the food entries done by the user. So when you key in food that is good for you, the system will highlight it in green. When it's not as good, it's orange, and it informs the user about their goal. So if you look at the example, here you have the use of olive oil that is getting this particular person close to the maximum amount of fat on a given day. And this is a really good design. I'm going to tell you why. Well, because it doesn't require any new action from the user. As soon as they log an item, the educational part just comes with. So if you use this food journal long enough, eventually information that is key to your health will register in your brain. And it will become second nature to choose better foods. And that is actually quite powerful, because when you're making those food choices, most likely you're not using the application. You'll be at the supermarket or at the restaurant, for example.
Next up, we have aesthetic experience, which is often overlooked. The truth is, it really does matter, especially in the pre-onboarding stage. The theme and the tone of the app should provide people with a sense of place and possibly even immersion. The aesthetics of an app can be portrayed through the voice and tone, or colors, or the usage of imagery, just to name a few. All of these need to match the intent of the app and the overall branding of the product. They should take into consideration any contextual sensitivities regarding the subject matter at hand, or cultural sensitivities based on the intended audience of the app. There's no right or wrong look for healthcare apps. It depends entirely on the individual app at hand. For example, if the intentions of an app is to provide a warm, soothing, and comfortable space to address a sensitive topic, it's probably not appropriate to accompany the experience with Robo, the personal advisor robot. To help you along with your journey, the personal advisor should instead feel warm and caring. Lastly, the aesthetics of the app should be consistent throughout the entire experience. The person using the app is relying on it to achieve a level of consistency around their newly formed habit. So it's important that the app itself provides a baseline of consistency that can be built upon. My Sugar is a management diabetes app. It uses humor to make content stick. It personalizes a diabetes monster, which jumps around, laughs, and makes a bunch of funny noises. While some users respond well to the humorous monster, it doesn't sit well with others. So it's important for this app to understand their audience and if this theme and if this tone is appropriate. And we're not saying if it is or not, we're just saying that that depends on the app's goals.
I like the little monster. So next, let's look at transcendence and empowerment. And these are big words, at least in my book. So what they mean is that the application should have elements, components that keep the user engaged after accomplishing their primary goal. And if that's not possible, because of lack of time, lack of money, the app should at least try to inform them on what's next. And these elements could potentially satisfy users' needs for feeling good. So that's at a high level, the transcendence part. And other elements might empower the user by elevating them from being just a user or a learner to becoming a mentor or even a contributor. And we brought along a concrete example to illustrate that principle. Period tracking, not an easy subject. Scientists just don't know much about the menstrual cycle. And Clue is a period tracking app that I have been using for years and I've recommended to many of my female friends. It's free and it has no ads, thank goodness. So a couple of years ago, following their success, they introduced Clue Plus, and that's to help them fund important research, continue to support data privacy, and help keep the app free for everybody. And that's a really interesting twist if you think about it for a second, because you're paying them money to become part of the story. And that's not a strategy that I've seen often. And I was hoping to find some public data to see how many paid subscribers they have compared to the free ones. I couldn't find any, but still, it's a great example to keep in mind when you're designing for behavior change.
There's an intricate relationship between the person using the app itself, and the environmental factors that impact both. We refer to this as the person-app environment loop. The app should monitor both the user and their environment around them, looking out for changes in either in order to adapt the experience as a result. For example, if the user hasn't logged their data for a while, the app should take notice. Maybe it's time to reflect upon some motivational content. Maybe they're facing a setback and it's time to revisit or revise some of the goals and expectations in order to continue being successful. Either way, the app cannot proceed as normal because a variable in the equation has changed. Similarly, the app shouldn't suggest that you go out for a run when it's raining. The app should seek to understand the environmental factors that are going to impact a person's engagement and performance. In addition to capturing changes and responding to them, the app can actually provide actionable steps to help a person adapt their environment to be more conducive towards the outcome. Whether it's avoiding a place that may tempt a person to fail, or to make changes to their home in order to help them achieve their goals, the environment is something that can both have an influence and be influenced. And some of the best apps out there are leveraging this. A great example that we love is Fabulous. It's an app that helps people build new habits by using insights from behavior science. You probably have heard of it, if not used it. Fabulous advises you to strategically place sticky notes throughout your space in order to remind you when you're not using the app. This is an excellent example of an app actively working to influence the environment, which in turn will influence the performance of the person.
And I just want to add, I'm a big fan of Fabulous. I've been using it for a while. And you can see, like on the sticky, you can write anything you want on the sticky, but Fabulous took it to another level by suggesting a pattern. So even if it's whether it's to brush your teeth or drink more water or go exercise, every time you look at the sticky, if you use their symbol, it not only reminds you that you have a goal that you've set for yourself, but also that Fabulous is there for you, which I find is really, really well executed on their end.
Absolutely. So in summary, there are three main topic areas we covered today. It's not easy. Behavior change is complex. Habits take time, and there are many factors at play. The second is the loop. It's important to understand the intricate relationship between the app, the person, and the environment, rather than solely relying on the app. And lastly, the principles. Usability alone is not enough to inspire meaningful change.
So that concludes our presentation on designing for behavior change. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we love talking about the subject, because we could really talk about behavior change all day. And before we open the floor for questions, please feel free to reach out to us via LinkedIn. You can see the links on the screen if you want to continue the discussion or see how Macadamian can potentially support you in your journey to create solutions that are conducive to behavior change. So thank you, and let's see if we have any questions in the chat. So we have one, I'm going to read it out loud. Have you been able to apply this to actual projects? Yes, absolutely. So we came up with that framework. We've been working on it for the past year and a half. And we were able to use it to evaluate existing health applications in the past 6 months. So we did one for epilepsy and another one for diabetes management. The other project that we did, we actually used the trust, credibility, and transparency principle to redesign a software that is used by surgeons. And it's a tool that uses AI diagnostics. And at the moment, we have one of our colleagues who's currently working with a company to create a roadmap for their product using all of our 13 principles.
I see another question here. I know a bit about behavior change, and I'm surprised you didn't mention social components, like being part of a group that helps you reach goals. So I'm really happy to hear this question. So as Carol mentioned, there's 13 principles in total, 6 of which we prioritize today. So the one that we didn't mention is human connection, and that is the need to satisfy a person's need for human connection, which covers some of the social aspects of an app. So if we were to evaluate an app, we definitely would look for an understanding of whether the app has direct or indirect social connection components, and confirm that the user is in charge of that manner, because different people have different degrees of that need and are willing to connect on different levels. So you definitely want to make sure that you're giving them the flexibility to connect with other users or a community on their own terms.
So we get another one. Is it more difficult to design for personal apps versus business apps? I'm going to say no, because our methodology is the same, right? So we want to get a deep understanding of the goals of the application, who's the target audience. So we're going to create personas. The journey mapping exercise will be the same, as long as we understand like what is it that we're trying to accomplish, that we can validate our assumptions with the target audience. I think that whether it's personal or business, we can absolutely accomplish that. I don't think it makes much of a difference. Would you agree, Alex?
I would, yeah, absolutely. Another question I see here: do you find it difficult to create a good user experience that will gain adoption without causing an addictive type of behavior? There's a lot of attention on that in the media right now. That's a really good question. So absolutely. The point of behavior change is to create app independence. So while the app is there to help you on your journey as you modify one behavior, so you have a current behavior and you have a desired behavior, and the app is there to get you from point A to point B. After you've reached point B, you should no longer need this app, and that's an ethical foundation of this framework. So app independence is the goal, so that you can now enjoy your new behavior or the lack of undesired behavior without the need for this app. And we actually have a principle for this. I think we briefly touched on it earlier, which is transcendence. So now that you've achieved your goal, whether it's medication adherence or your fitness goal, where's the rest of the growth? Are you going to become a mentor or a contributor in your community? Can you inspire others? Do you want to continue with the app, or are you done? And that's the extent of your journey now that you've achieved your goal. So definitely throughout the framework, there are ethical checks in the scoring framework, and we want to make sure that we're not using any dark patterns, that everything is transparent to the user, including the way their data is used, and that we're not causing any addictive types of behaviors.
I completely agree. I mean, if you're done with the app, you're basically done, right? You're ready to live your own journey. So I think that's a huge difference between with, let's say, what some of you may have seen in the Social Dilemma documentary, right, on Netflix, for example. So we have another question. Do you ever run into resistance with clients who may struggle to fully embrace this approach?
Not yet.
Well, I was going to say, yes, I think not resistance, but there's an educational component that definitely comes with that framework. So at Macadamian, we're really lucky as designers to be able to collaborate with data scientists and researchers in general. So, I'm going to say when there's resistance, let's just let the data speak for itself, right? So if we're allowed to do the research, and we usually do it really well, then, the client will come to terms with the fact that whatever they had in mind, let's say they wanted something really shiny, really crazy, doesn't necessarily make sense for their user. Usually they understand, they just, follow along. And that's not just for behavior change. I'm going to say it applies to user experience in general. I mean, we have done hundreds of projects, Alex, right? Creating user experience for all kinds of clients. And they all think they know how to design, better websites. They all have their own preference. And they're going to say, make it look like Amazon. I think, Facebook looks pretty amazing. I want Messenger and things like that. So, we just take everything their needs, and then we make sure we validate our designs, and then eventually the truth comes out.
I've seen another one here I could pick up. How do you build in this design approach over the lifespan of an application? So there are two kind of directions you can take this framework into. One is to evaluate an existing solution, and through those heuristics or principles, check where we're really strong and where we could find some opportunities for improvement. And the second is to design something from scratch. And in general, we see the development of such an application to be an iterative process. So as long as we can achieve something together and bake in the analytics in order to understand what's working and what isn't, and we can continue to iterate and optimize, we can continue to use these principles throughout the entire lifespan, trying out what works, and then continue to build on that.
Definitely. The sooner the better, right? Because it's always less costly to test our theories when we're still designing. But on the other hand, it's never too late, right? Alex, you said we can evaluate existing applications. So if they are being developed, or if they've already been developed for a while and they need a refresh, we can do that too, right? It's never too late to make improvements.
Absolutely.
So we have another one. What has been an especially challenging project? Ooh, I don't know how much we can give away. So I have an example that is not healthcare, but I'm going to say retail, in which we had to create a completely new platform to help employees manage product information. I'm going to say, like, things that you may buy, like at the supermarket, and how they handle promotions. And they have been working with a very constraining platform. And they said, well, we want to step away from that platform. We want it to be as easy as possible for an employee to manage their inventory and make sure, they can calculate pricing as efficiently as possible, which was really a great idea in principle, like a great vision. But the reality is that they had a staff of about 400 people hacking the system in different ways, working with stickies and spreadsheet and cheat sheets, just because of that very constraining technical framework, and that it was a real challenge for them to take a step back and understand that if we really wanted to make this easier on them, they actually had also to change the way they work and interact with the system on a daily basis. So I'm going to say, in all transparency, that the design we came up with wasn't that innovative. I think it ended up being some kind of a compromise between what they had, which was very, very heavy and difficult to use, and that vision that they've been carrying for years and that they were not quite able to accomplish.
That's a good example. I think I know the project you're referring to.
Yes, you do.
What skills should a company have in-house to support this approach over the long term? So, we've seen mixes, team mixes of all sorts. I think that if I had to uh, single out the most important key to success over the long term, I would call out research. I think that it's the foundation to implementing this framework. It's also the key to optimizing and continuing to iterate your solution for the long term. If you have a good understanding of your users, how they're using your product, what's working and what isn't, you always have a direction to make it better. That's the one key I think I can point out. Yeah.
Agreed.
Huh.
Okay, so I think that was the last question. So I think this is it for us. Thank you so much to the Availity team for having us, for inviting us to this event. And again, like if you want to continue talking about behavior change, please reach out to us via LinkedIn. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.